So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the other day compares what's going on the southern border to concentration camps. She even goes as far as to say never again. I made a comment on this. I made a video talking about it where I said she's jumping the shark. This is her getting quite crazy. And then following all of this, right? Look, I made my point. I think she's nuts. But something interesting happened. It became a much bigger story. And for some reason, the left jumped on board to defend her comments. Let me make one thing absolutely clear. These are not, by any definition, I should say by some definitions, they are concentration camps, sure. But by any modern connotation and explicit encyclopedic definition, they are not. And don't take my word for it. How about Encyclopedia Britannica, which refers to an internment center for political prisoners, members of national or minority groups who are confined for reasons of state security, exploitation, or punishment, usually by executive decree or military order. Now, you may be saying, Tim, well, it does kind of sound like what's happening on the border, except they are also to be distinguished from refugee camps or detention and relocation centers for the temporary accommodation of large numbers of displaced persons. They are not concentration camps. That's absurd. More importantly, when you do a Google search, you very clearly get one specific definition. The first thing that comes up is Britannica, which I just read you. And you also get all of this stuff about World War II Germany. So yes, you're incorrect. And let me just also add to this. I did a story yesterday about, or 2 days ago, people from the Congo who travel to Angola, who fly to Brazil, who then make the journey up through Colombia and several South American and Central American countries to finally make it through Mexico to come to our southern border, and then I guess, according to Cortez, to get in line for a concentration camp? That's insane. It's absurd. Now, I certainly detest the conditions at these concentration camps. If you haven't read about them, you should. They call one place the freezer. These are really dangerous and gross places. The problem? We don't have the funding for them. And according to the New York Times, they said Congress needs to give Trump the money he needs. Now, let's get to the main point. What do you think comes next? When Ocasio-Cortez says, never again, these are concentration camps, what do you think comes next? Do you think people just sit on their hands? When someone with over 4 million followers on Twitter, yes, a very prominent, one of the most prominent politicians now, whether you like it or not, she is, goes on a live stream, I think she had like 7,000 live viewers, creates a national story where you now have two sides arguing whether it is or it isn't. Many people might say, Tim, nothing will come of this, right? It's just more political posturing. They're trying to smear Trump for 2020, sure. But it only takes one crazy person who says, first they came for you, then they came for me, never again. She said, never again. So I assure you, we are walking towards this point where you will end up with these resistance types who watch Rachel Maddow every day, who believe Russiagate and all this other nonsense and the fascists are coming, and they're going to be whipped into a frenzy, and they genuinely believe they're fighting against World War II Germany. This is the rhetoric we are seeing, and it's being defended. So here's what I'm going to do. I personally disagree with what she said. I believe she needs to absolutely walk it back and present some rationality. Listen, my opinion is not rooted in any kind of support for conservatives or Trump. I think we've got serious problems on the border. My opinion is closer to that of the New York Times. Give the funding to help border security and provide for these facilities. But can I just stress, my opinion falls in line with Encyclopedia Britannica. It is not a fringe position. It is not left or right. It is literally just an academic approach that concentration camps are distinguished from refugee camps, detention centers, or relocation centers for temporary accommodation for large numbers of displaced persons, which is quite literally what is happening. Are the conditions good? They're not. They're really bad. I'm appalled by that. My response? Vote for funding, allocate more money. Is that wrong? Wanting to provide food and shelter? Let's do this. Let's go through some of the things I've pulled up. There's some really interesting comments. CNN even defending the semantics, which I think is very dangerous. First, we have Julia Ioff. I believe I'm pronouncing her name incorrectly, but she says, "Hi, actual Jew here who lost dozens of relatives in the Holocaust. Concentration camps predated the Holocaust. For example, the Soviets had them before the Nazis. Yes, and gulags." She said, "I would also kindly ask Liz Cheney and Meghan McCain and other self-appointed defenders of the Jewish people who actually have no skin in the game to stop using us as political football, or at the very least, call out your own party members. So let me explain to you the problem with the Twitterati political posturing. Here we have someone who is saying that she is Jewish, who lost family, and I certainly am willing to listen to your opinion, and I can respect it. You have more understanding of this than I do. The problem is, we also have this. Benny Johnson tweeted an actual Holocaust survivor who said, "Stop saying this, you are wrong." Who do you agree with? The left and the right have both found Holocaust survivors who have argued it is or it isn't. There was one video put out, I can't remember by which outlet, I wasn't able to find it, where they had some old women who survived the Holocaust saying it is that. Like, we are in the face of this dangerous future and fascism, etc. The rhetoric is there. The actual survivor said this. Then you see the Daily Caller bring this survivor who says, "No, we're not. How dare you? Whose side are you on?" It's really just semantics. It's people arguing it is or isn't. To the point of Julia Ioffe, we then had David Harsanyi saying that's why she used, quote, "never again," right? Because she was talking about the Boer War. Listen, as I show you on Google and Britannica, there is a clear connotation and understanding of what concentration camp really means. And for some reason, for political points, they're defending Ocasio-Cortez. And I've got another thread that's really interesting. But let's move on. So maybe you don't want to trust the two survivors the left and the right have brought up. We have this story from Esquire. An expert on concentration camps says that's exactly what the U.S. is running at the border. The reason I bring this up is not to... They say things can be concentration camps without being Dachau or Auschwitz. Absolutely. The problem is, here's my thought. If you want to make a statement about internment, detention centers, you know why they're saying concentration camp. They're not saying it because it's the base semantic definition. They're saying it because of the connotation for what it is. In fact, there are many people on the left who have tweeted that. Many of the Twitterati leftists. I have the tweets. I don't want to drag people who are smaller channels and smaller journalists, so I'll leave that out. These are people who are higher profile. But they said, effectively, let's call them what they are so everyone understands what's happening. Yes, they are. They want that connotation. Okay, well, that's crazy. And in my opinion, it's going to lead to people doing crazy things. Before we go on, the next bit I want to highlight is Dave Rubin calling out CNN because CNN, Cuomo defended this. But my question then is, like, what do you think happens next? What do you think comes next if people really believe this? If CNN is going on TV and saying, we know what these are, we know what's happening, they then conflate nationalism with World War II Germany as well. What do you think happens next when you repeatedly tell the population, this large faction of resistance types, this is literally happening? They believe it. Will Chamberlain drags Ilhan Omar, who's concerned about the language illegal aliens, saying, imagine complaining about this language while referring to border detention centers as concentration camps. But he goes on to highlight that this is a semantic campaign. The goal is to change the definition of the word. They want to redefine nationalism as bad and expand concentration camps to include detention centers. He says it's not the first. They wanted to change the definition of racism and white supremacy. Conservatives sometimes mistakenly assume that words have a fixed or objective meaning. They don't. At most, they have a best reading. And this is one thing I explain to people as well. Dictionaries don't tell you what a word means. They tell you how it's commonly used, like what people are trying to convey by saying it. So a dictionary can say something is true, but if people decide to use a word in a different way, then the word's usage becomes something entirely different. This is the goal of many of these people, as Will defines it, a semantic campaign. The goal is to get many people on the left to expand the definition, because then you solidify the connotation. Is what's happening on the southern border a concentration camp? 100% no. They are temporary detention facilities. They have horrible conditions, but there's food, there's shelter, people are getting sick, we need more supplies and more resources. Nobody is cutting off their food. Nobody is trying to exterminate anybody. In fact, many of these people are being released under asylum claims. The problem is that we have record-breaking numbers of people coming up through South America and even from Africa. It's a serious crisis that even the major newspapers have acknowledged. But someone brought up an interesting thread, maybe a bit partisan. It's a writer for Breitbart, so take that for what it is. But he said, the biggest idiot in Congress drove a dump truck full of flaming toxic waste off a cliff, and most of the left leaped into the void after her yelling Auschwitz was so bad. And claiming that never again has nothing to do with, what actually happened in World War II Germany. On that day, Trump launched his re-election bid. It was the slowest pitch Democrats could have tossed over home plate when Trump stepped up to bat. He couldn't have orchestrated a better launch if he could have hypnotized Dems into doing whatever he wanted. The Dems played perfectly into Trump's pitch as the only defense middle America has against a gang of raging left-wing kooks. The public knows the Dems are trying to erase the southern border, and they don't want that. I don't want to read into too much more of what he said, but the first point I want to absolutely highlight, go after, that Ocasio-Cortez said something nonsensical and extreme, and she drove it off a cliff. And instead of anyone willing to say, walk it back, AOC, they chased after her. What we're seeing here is common in this current political era. Very common. When you have people on the left saying something extreme, and because the others say, hey, walk it back, like Republicans or conservatives, then all of a sudden you'll see a bunch of people on the left defending it for tribal reasons. I'm shocked that anybody would try and defend what she's saying, but it's tribalism. They do not want to concede anything. So even though you have the major newspapers saying there's a crisis, even though we have people from Africa flying to South America, making their way up and doing all these things, they don't want to admit it's a crisis. They want to just argue that it's immoral, that it's wrong, that it's racist. And then people say that the Democrats are for open borders. Well, that's actually not true. Bernie Sanders makes a really great point. But the Democrats are not the woke Twitterati. And the woke Twitterati are pushing the Democrats in ridiculous directions. So if you refuse to fund border security, and the New York Times says Congress do this, the Wall Street Journal points out there's a crisis, if the major papers of this country, which lean, New York Times leaning left, are saying we have a problem, and the Democrats try to obstruct, they're following in line with Democratic socialists who have protested saying abolish borders. Not hyperbole. They've literally held up signs saying abolish borders. Now, the Democratic socialists don't dictate what, anyone is supposed to be doing, necessarily. They're a small group of people, relatively small. The Democrats as a whole have basically just hid from the issue, while Bernie Sanders has had no problem saying, no, there's too many poor people in this world, they'll all want to come here. And I can respect that. The Democrats are trying to win, and because of the woke Twitterati and because of Cortez, they refuse to take strong positions on border security. They refuse to fund border security. They don't want to give Trump his victory, and they don't want to side with passive liberals. And therein lies the big problem. Politics today is dominated by moderates, conservatives, and far-left activists. Passive liberals are not engaging. You may be a passive liberal watching this video, and you're not engaging. You're not. I told this to one of my friends. I was talking to her, and she said she supported Bernie, and, her politics probably fall like 2008 Democrat, Obama. And I said the reason things are going to hell in a handbag is because the woke Twitterati left is leading the pack, and passive liberals are just being dragged in the cart, and they're not paying attention, they're not saying anything. So then you get these politicians, Pelosi. Pelosi has done good to resist a bit, absolutely. She's criticized Cortez. You end up with Biden refusing to engage in a lot of ways, but also still pandering to this woke identitarianism, talking about white man's culture and stuff like that. Because passive liberals are not engaging, there's no incentive for any of these Democratic politicians to try and play to the base. These people, they're hoping, would just vote Democrat regardless. What they need to do is convince the far left to stay on their side because they need those numbers. So as much as you could say absolutely, like regular old Democrats are not in favor of open borders, the problem is the woke Twitterati is leading the pack and they're following them off the cliff. And I'll tell you what's going to happen. If Democrats don't get strong on borders, you will see a backlash. I mean, Trump is already that backlash. Bernie and Trump were both strong on borders. Bernie's not the strongest necessarily, but Bernie's been a really interesting case because when asked about ICE, abolishing ICE, he's refused to say it. And he's just said comprehensive immigration reform. What does that even mean? It's clear that Bernie understands the importance of border security. It's clear that many of these Democrats who voted in favor of border security 10 years ago know exactly what they need to do, but they don't want to say it because they're scared of Twitter. And they're scared of these digital media outlets who believe that their ivory tower opinions represent America. They don't. So they're setting themselves on fire. Ocasio-Cortez said some nonsensical things. She is not a particularly bright individual. I'm not trying to be mean, but she has had gaffe after gaffe after gaffe, okay? Thinking accounting errors are literal money, thinking tax breaks are spendable cash. She has made many misstatements, as reported by PolitiFact and the Washington Post. There's no need to defend her. When she says something good, defend her. She wants to team up with Ted Cruz to restrict lobbying for politicians. Spot on. I think she's got it right there. And so does Ted Cruz. So I appreciate that. That bipartisan, action to me is incredible. But when she says things about farting cows in her Green New Deal thing, and then pulls it down saying, ooh, it was a mistake, it was an early draft, why would you ever write about farting cows? Why would that ever come up? It's because they're immature and they don't know what they're talking about, and they made a huge mistake, and they try to walk it back. So yes, Ocasio-Cortez repeatedly makes mistakes, but instead of saying it was a mistake and we can accept that, they double down and defend her. And now you have people on CNN, on Twitter, rushing to her defense saying, yep, she's right. Yep. And now this solidifies national level rhetoric. For a while, people on the woke left, the activists, were saying what's going on the southern border are concentration camps. But it was just the woke left. It was just this fringe group. Well, Ocasio-Cortez has laundered that rhetoric now to the national level, and all of a sudden these journalists and high-profile individuals are rushing to her defense for the sake of tribalism. Ocasio-Cortez does not represent America. In fact, according to a poll, admittedly from a PAC that doesn't necessarily like her, her favorability is very low in her own district. However, we have seen legitimate polls showing that to be the case. Long story short, Ocasio-Cortez won through an exploit called primarying. And we know this. Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks has talked about it. That was the goal, to upset, longstanding Democrats because their districts only vote blue. Nancy Pelosi said a glass of water with a D on it would win in Pelosi's or Cortez's district, so we get it. Cortez isn't representative of America. She may represent a certain woke, activist base, less than 8% of the country, according to Hidden Tribes, but not Americans. And I think, the reason I'm very critical of this is, for one, I act on principle. If Cortez says something nonsensical, I'll call it out. I just did a whole video about Trump saying, wanting to ban burning the American flag, and I said, absolutely not. And Candace Owens said the same thing, absolutely not. Principle comes first. There are certain things we want to protect and live by. I don't care which tribe you're in. But what we can see here is that principle has been thrown out the window. Ocasio-Cortez is going to escalate. I don't know what you want to call it. We can call it a violent escalation of some capacity. But when you have millions of people who really do believe Trump is worse than World War II Germany's leader, you know what I'm talking about, what do you think they're going to do? People always say never again. There's that famous poem, First They Came for the Unions, etc. That was a lesson in not sitting idly by when these things start to happen. But fortunately, they're not. These are people who are lining up at our borders trying to come in, not people who are living in the country being rounded up and kicked out. Although Trump is planning mass deportations, it still is a bit different. There's certainly an argument to be had about making sure we do everything in as humane a way as possible, and that's the side I fall on. And I certainly fall on the side of providing funding to make sure we can take care of children and protect loss of life, ensure comfortable conditions, but we do need to disincentivize the behavior because we can't handle it. The borders are being overrun. CBP has said in an official statement, this is a full-blown emergency. I don't know what the solution is. I certainly don't like seeing people suffer, and we should solve this problem. But simply posturing on your bed in your luxury apartment in DC about how this is basically, happening all over again does nothing. Imagine being that person to think it really is happening. So what do? You sit on your bed and do nothing. She's in politics. She propose something. Vote to fund this stuff. We have to solve the problem. Tell me what the alternatives are. Do we just shut them down? Let people wander out? Some people have actually told me yes. Okay, well then consider what happens next. Families, children wandering through the wilderness in the desert with no food or water. Does that make sense? It really doesn't. Do you want to just open the border? Well, the Democrats say they don't. The Democrats have repeatedly said they're not for open borders. Okay then. What do you want to do? If you're not for open borders, then you agree that something should be done and law enforcement will need to, detain people for a set amount of time. Temporary detainment while we figure out where they get relocated to, right? Apparently that's not good enough either. It seems like no matter what happens, the Democrats just complain about it and offer no real solutions. So I'm listening. I'm waiting for a solution. I'm not happy with what's going on the border. I certainly think it's dangerous to act like we're in World War II Germany, but I want to see a solution to the border more than anybody. And I'm asking the Democrats, please provide something. Instead, nothing. They just escalate the rhetoric and it's going to get bad. So this could go on for a million years. I'll leave it here. Stick around. The next segment will be coming up at 1 p.m. And comment below. Let me know what you think. If you're on the podcast, leave a review. I'll see you all in the next segment.